Well, thank you very much to each of our panelists and discussants. I think you've heard a very rich set of perspectives about the potential and the use of different kinds of evidence by different end users. We want to, at this time, invite any of you to come to microphones and to tell us who you are and to react to any of what you heard. I guess I'll just start by saying I think it's very interesting to hear, and it would be great, maybe even the person at the microphone could help us with this, but others in the room, the terminology itself, I think, is a bit of a stumbling block, this concept of real-world evidence, and whether that's ultimately the right terminology. It'd be interesting to sort of think about that. To some extent, what I heard among our different panelists is that there is a desire for scientifically derived evidence, but that there are different ways to perhaps do that, and that the way that this needs to happen perhaps needs to be more adaptable to the specific needs of different entities, whether it be a payer, a provider, or patient. And to some extent, I think there's some confounding between what is going on with regard to how we think about the way in which this evidence or information is derived, and whether or not deriving it through different methods than the traditional randomized controlled trial means having to abandon scientific principles. And I think, in fact, as Dr. Califf mentioned earlier, I don't think that was the intention of what was put forward with the law, but I think there is some confounding or conflating of those concepts to some extent. So perhaps what is needed is adaptability of being able to use scientific methods to achieve the needs of different end users. But I welcome now your questions or comments. Dr. Califf?
Sure. Rob Califf from Duke and Verily Life Sciences. I'll just spew out a couple of things, and I don't want to put a little heat on the health system folks here, if I can. And they seem very capable of defending themselves, so I'm not worried that I'll be offensive. But I mean, just to try it out again on the terminology, it did get screwed up in the law. And what I learned at FDA is that when it is written into law, it tends to get adopted by people and to get done that way. So we need to, I think, advertise the correction that was made in the law to get this right. But the concept was that there are two dimensions that we're talking about here. One is what's the source of your data. And the source could range all the way from a special research clinic, which is totally divorced from clinical care, to a hospital or a clinic where healthcare is being delivered, and the research is done totally within that context, all the way now to a patient's home or their car or whatever they're doing, which is now entirely feasible. So that's the source of your data. The other dimension is what's the method that you use to design your analysis and to derive a conclusion. And for prospective studies, obviously, it's design your study. For using extant data, it may just be design your analysis. And just to put my marker down on this, I don't think the criteria on the scientific side ought to differ at all depending on the audience. But what I do think is that the degree of certainty that you need is quite different depending on the audience. So a regulator by law has a different degree of certainty required to pass a judgment and put something in a label. A payer has to make a payment decision and can't say, well, come back, 5 years with other evidence. You have to make that decision, and patients are faced with the same thing. And consumers, as I've learned in my life in Google world, are looking at information and making judgments every day. And I think actually suffering because we don't do a good enough job in guiding them to scientific truth and expertise. So there's great susceptibility on the internet to false information and to trends that occur that can be very misleading, like a newspaper story comes out and all of a sudden there's a flurry of adverse stuff, which is totally out of context and can affect people. So the question I wanted to ask the three health system people, and I thought all of them described it pretty well. It almost sounds like the health systems are passive recipients of all this stuff. And the question is, what is your obligation to fix it? Because you're having to make decisions with very imperfect evidence. You control the system by which real-world evidence could be collected and shared in a much greater fashion. What measures could you take to rev up the system? I think the latest number I've seen in cardiology is still 85% of decisions made without high-quality evidence. Our opioid guidelines, 0 for 13, have high-quality evidence out of the major recommendations. And I was struck by Dan's description, which now that I'm back in academics, I completely understand and agree with. Your average investigator these days is actually doing okay and doesn't really feel any particular need to change. And yet you have such obvious gaps in our knowledge that are not being filled in.
Yeah, let me take a stab at that first. I think that's a very appropriate question and frankly a challenge. And I think all of us are from organizations that think we do have an obligation, and although we may have selected for those because we're here in the first place. So, but the fact is that again, because we control the dollar and the policies, we're in a unique position to really reward and to encourage certain behaviors or types of activities. So a couple of points I'll make. First is that we have many organizations, because of some of the work we've been doing with outcomes-based payment, which are coming to us and saying, we understand. In fact, many of these are not yet public. They're for drugs that are not yet released. And they're saying, we understand that a drug is going to be expensive. There may be questions. How can we work with you proactively to think about outcome measures that we are looking at on our phase 3? That we should be measuring what's important to you, what's important to the patients that you serve, and how can we even think about the pricing in a way that's rational and that demonstrates that we have belief in our products. So first of all, that is happening, and I think it can be influential. Second, because of our relationship with the provider systems that we work with closely, and again, the Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute, and you'll hear from its lead executive director, chairman, Dr. Richard Platt later, but they've done a terrific job of helping us understand how we can leverage their expertise to actually take some of the work we're doing pragmatically with these sponsors and ensure that it's done right in an academic setting so that it's not just observational, although it is real world, but that it is actually of a caliber where it could be published in a peer-reviewed journal and be credible. So just because we're working with industry, we don't want to soften the approach and have something that can't be viewed as credible. The other point I'll make is that we are working with many of these entities to try to understand how to better incorporate real-world evidence. So one of the limitations of our outcomes-based agreements is the data that's available to us. But I know, for example, that our institute is working on an app that can support the work of Sentinel that will allow them to pull in patient-reported data and match that up with the claims data in a way that will provide a more robust data set. So I think there's a lot of exciting things that are happening that will allow us to make a difference and fulfill the responsibility you mentioned.
Let me just add a few comments to that, and certainly echo all the comments that Michael made. We do feel a strong sense obligation to contribute to medical knowledge. Our research, all the research institutes within Kaiser Permanente, we all have public funding to a degree. We all do contribute to generalizable medical knowledge and are all part of our community benefit, which means we contribute to medical knowledge. I want to, though, turn it around a little bit, and when we talk about our obligations to make changes in the system, I still always go back to research roots, and every good research question requires to ask the right question. And so from the right question, we can say what data is needed. It's interesting. I think when a lot of this was comments from Sharon, to ask the right question, we also have to ask inclusion, exclusion criteria in the same way every good research study and every good research trial would do that and have fidelity to that. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is that it also tells us sometimes how much, power analyses, how much data do we need? And so that then tells me, for one, I work in Kaiser Permanente Mid-Atlantic. does our patient population provide us a sufficient number and diversity to answer that question? Then if we need more data, who do we then collaborate and partner with to get that question answered, employing the right statistical methods? And I will tell you, for some observational studies, the statistical methods are still being developed. They are not there yet. And finally, then the question always comes in, and who's paying for this? Data costs. Data is not, I do not have on my laptop a icon that says the Kaiser Permanente HIV database, and I can click it and magic appears. It really requires work to pull the data, to then analyze it correctly, create your correct groups. And this is a whole field of analytics that I would like to say that systems like Harvard Pilgrim, Kaiser Permanente are really at the forefront of. But I would also say with everything, there has to be a certain degree of caution.
Well, we have other questions, but I'll just say quickly that, I mean, I think one way is to get the health system to, when they have problems, the real life problems that they're dealing with, they're trying to figure out, to try to first go to their local research community with clinicians to start. And you'd think, well, that's obvious, but it isn't really. And we've done this before, where the health system identifies problems and creates some type of mini RFA to get teams together to try to do that. We just started this an Epic Scholars program where we're taking 20 clinicians that have their own problem. They apply, we give them a biostatistician, a data manager, we try to help them answer the questions, and that's just starting. But I think that the other one is to really try to develop, and this issue about data warehouses. Should you have a research data warehouse and a clinical data warehouse? As soon as you do that, you create a lot of separation, a lot of extra costs. But I'm surprised that, in our projects, like I said, any PRO that's collected for research, we say belongs in our EMR. That is not the majority of health systems' opinions right now. And it gets all the way to, well, the clinicians and the patients don't know how to interpret the data. There needs to be a whole training to try to do that. So now you have, PROs, and I mean, for those of us that work on this, even the common data model for coordinated stuff still has not really done a great job of incorporating PROs into it. So that is certainly something that I think you want to strongly encourage, this intersection of the clinical and research, and then maybe in 50 years we won't have this separation between research data and real world evidence.
Thank you. Michael Sewald is my name. I work for Novartis Pharmaceuticals. I have a question that would maybe benefit from an answer from a payer or provider point of view. As I listen to your presentations, I think you are also very much self-enabled. You have research units, you collect a lot of data, you collaborate across the country, so that's really impressive to see. Now, the question is really, where would you look for help? For instance, from FDA, or maybe also from companies bringing new technologies. What could be a better evidence package, for instance? Where would you like to improve, and someone could help?
So if I hear the question correctly, it's sort of how does outside entities interface with whether it's providers or payers to be able to do the kinds of jobs and needs you have around evidence?
Partially, yes, absolutely. But also, for instance, what is the expectation from payers and providers on FDA to help redefining rules, setting standards, helping the data collection? Is there something you would like to unload so it becomes more efficient at a national level?
Again, that's an interesting question, and I'm kind of scratching my head how to answer it. But it occurs to me that more and more we're looking at organizations. I mentioned ICER before as an example. So there are, and I would also think of other guideline-setting organizations. So the one thing I'll say about payers, in general, we don't want to be seen as making up the evidence or the policy. We want them based on something objective and something ideally that smarter people than us have figured out. So there is a benefit to more work being done early on to instantiate approaches into guidelines, which kind of make it easier for us to approve them. Similarly, if you look at why there's such interest in ICER, I think it represents the fact that that is a gap that is seen in the current evidence set. Understanding some of the things we're looking at, in terms of the cost per quality adjusted life year, the budget impact, some of the assessments they're looking at, whether it is very impactful or minor, moderate, et cetera. So the fact that we're looking at these outside entities, to me, says there is an opportunity and a gap.
I had a question, but first I wanted to, thank Sharon for a marvelous presentation. And you were being sort of, self-deprecating when you mentioned that your credential is in religious studies. But I did want to point out that's probably more relevant to the topic of this meeting than most any other credential of anyone in the room. And we probably should have started the meeting with a review of research practices through the lens of the Rabbinical Purity Code in Leviticus. But maybe that's a paper you and I can write someday. So my question, though, is for one or both of the Michaels. I can't remember which one of you first mentioned it, but you both mentioned, I think you even used the term surprise when you talked about the advent of new hepatitis C therapies. Sort of as if there was this humongous new thing that was thrown over the transom and you were struggling with what does this mean, how do we deal with it? So my question's sort of a magic wand question. If you had a magic wand and you could have at that time somehow said, this is the evidence I need. This is the evidence that sitting in my chair I need, and I would like that to be available at the moment of licensure to tell me what is the value of this treatment, what's its appropriate use. So do the magic wand thing, because I'm not saying that evidence could be produced very quickly, but what might you have wanted at that moment?
Yeah, and just to clarify, the Hep C example is a little different, and I'll speak to that. And the reason I say that is for Hep C, that's a drug that works close to 100% of the time if used appropriately in the right population. So there's different levels of questions that emerge. One of the questions is a degree to which the evidence is sufficient. The problem with Hep C, wasn't that the evidence wasn't sufficient. It isn't that it doesn't work. I didn't think there was a benefit, for example, to an outcomes-based agreement that would create additional work, but it wasn't a question about the efficacy. The problem was the cost. And the issue there, so that's a different type of information, which is less about evidence. To put it bluntly, there are, depending on the estimate you believe, anywhere between 3 and 5 million Americans with hepatitis C. So the thought that we would see something that impacts that large population at the price that it came out originally, frankly, didn't occur to anyone. Everyone thought it would be priced far less. And the problem, if you're a payer, as I mentioned, if you're trying to aim not-for-profit, aiming for a 1% margin, or for-profit, trying to deliver on what you told your investors, it creates a bit of a surprise. Now, if we knew about that ahead of time, what the budget impact was, we could still debate whether it was priced appropriately or not, but we could have sat down with our actuaries and others on the regulatory side and priced it in to our models so that we didn't end up having to make hard decisions. Do we accept losses? Do we try to limit it in the interim, et cetera, as many payers did? So the information there was really about the budget impact. More broadly, though, there are cases where we're not sure what the addressable population is. So in the post-Hep C era, we're spending a lot more time with our CFO trying to create those budget impacts ourselves. And that requires, among other things, again, Hep C was a little simpler in that the effectiveness is clear, but for those where there are different responses and it's not always very obvious to us what the right population is and how to model it out, that's where we could use some help in understanding that.
So there were two notes, and Hep C, I think, is illustrative on these examples. One of the bigger issues was because prior to these newer agents for Hep C, the treatment had limited efficacy and effectiveness, was really hard to take, and the diagnostics required included often a liver biopsy, which is a general rule most patients don't like. So as a result, when this new agents came out, we also had to play catch up in terms of who was our population at risk, who was the screened population. We had to put in efforts, in fact, into screening and into newer modalities of non-invasive staging for hepatitis C. Now, do I believe in the end we've done the right thing, and do I believe that we are moving forward in curing a disease? And as someone who treats HIV, for me it's very exciting to say I'm curing the disease. Yes, but it was a much more multi-step development and plan required than just looking at the one drug trial, going to our benefits committee or even going to our formulary committee and saying please add. So I think there was a lot more in here, and there really was some true actuarial ongoing budget analytics that are actually very exciting from an economic research standpoint, but may be beyond the discussion for today.
Ross McKinney from the Association of American Medical Colleges. I have two linked questions. The first question is a matter of definition. I'm hearing some fuzziness about what real-world evidence means. And does real-world evidence mean observation, or is it a methodology to gather information from medical records that were going to be obtained? Does it exclude the possibility of randomization, for example, clusterized randomized trials? Because I think that layering cluster randomized trials on real-world evidence will be a more efficient way to gather information. So is that, in general, in people's definition of what real-world evidence includes, actively introducing an intervention that will involve participation?
Yes, I would say it is included. I would say it's not exclusive. I would say anytime you're going to try to randomize, even randomizing by clinic, you have a very hard time doing it. It is not pure. You are assuming that clinics in a health system don't talk to each other, don't communicate, that there isn't cross-pollination, even at a level maybe below the level of the prescribing physician, that influences that behavior. The analytics required are far more complex than a classic randomized clinical trial. I do think it includes it, but I think sometimes also you need to first look at the data already collected to see what answers you can provide, and that should also help direct how you move forward.
So my second linked question is that I would propose we really lack the regulatory and ethical framework to do this most effectively, that we haven't set up appropriate regulations to define there's an ethical construct. When you prospectively enroll somebody in a study, the construct is, I give you my permission in an active way to a question to use my data in some constructive way. When we begin using real-world evidence, we've taken one step away from that. And where we need lines to define where privacy, where confidentiality, and where communal good can each take the highest stand. And we don't have those regulations, and my bias is we missed the chance when we revised the common rule, and we still need to. If we're going to use real-world evidence, we need to redefine what the regulations and the ethical framework are around how we do this work.
They were on their feet first.
Very kind of you. We'll get to you next.
Hi, Jesse Berlin from Johnson & Johnson. I was going to get into the discussion about who does the study, but I think it was adequately covered by my boss. But I do just want to emphasize the notion of transparency, and then I have a real question. Transparency about methods, transparency about analysis plans, and transparency about how decisions are made, and particularly reimbursement decisions. So right now, I've seen plenty of examples where there's a lot of mystery. There's a publication, and there's no detail on the methods, and so I think we need to get away from that whole thing. Question, though, has to do with this notion of outcomes-based reimbursement, and I don't want to make this just about cost or price. And it's closely tied to the idea of predictive modeling. Because if you're going to figure out how to do a good job of reimbursing on outcomes, you want to figure out who's going to respond and who's going to have an adverse effect potentially. So they're closely tied notions. And I want to try to make this a coherent question. If we're in the development stage and we have a biomarker that says, like HER2/neu allows us to predict who's going to respond to Herceptin, but most of the time we're talking about situations where we don't really understand who's going to respond until a product is out on the market. And that's when we get the diverse population. And it's that diversity that allows us to look at the subgroups and figure out who's going to respond, who's going to do badly. And I guess it's more of a comment, and I'd be interested in the panel's reactions. This has implications for the development. Because one argument is you do your studies initially, we've been flirting with this idea, do your studies initially on broader populations. So even at the stage of the first phase 3 study, you've got a broader, more diverse population, and that allows you to get to this idea of predicting who's going to respond. But that's not cheap to do. And so, circling back around to this idea of reimbursement is, doing things in a targeted way is not necessarily less expensive than doing them in the way we're doing them now. So I'm just interested in your comments.
Again, I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but I'll try to comment anyway. There are examples of emerging biomarkers which lead to use of certain therapeutics, which I think we all agree is a positive trend and hope to see more of for reasons that I think are obvious. There are cases, though, where there may be opportunity to expand use, and we're not quite sure what's going to happen, which is, I think, what you're alluding to. What I would like to see and would propose, and have proposed to some companies that have, for the most part, not taken me up on this, is that in cases where we're seeking to expand coverage, let's say of a cancer therapeutic where we're really not sure what's going to happen for those with a related mutation, go ahead, prescribe the drug, but don't send us a bill if it doesn't meet some endpoint, which we all agree defines success. Again, it requires collaboration from industry. I will share that we had anecdotally an example recently where we had a patient with cystic fibrosis who did not meet technically the criteria for Orkambi, which is not an inexpensive drug. Now, we haven't been able to do that kind of agreement that I'd like to with Vertex, but one of my pharmacists took that case to me and she said, this is an unusual mutation. There's never going to be a clinical trial for this. And we said, ultimate lens, what's the right thing to do? What would we want for a member of our family? And we agreed, let's cover it anyway. Evidence be damned, sorry to say that here, but for a few months and see what happens and take it from there. But again, many payers won't do that, but I think going to approaches where you agree to cover expand in cases where it works, gets you around some of the barriers, and is a pragmatic approach to bridging some of these divides and again, ensuring access to those who need it.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say, when the design of particularly those phase 3 is to take into account all the views of the clinicians and scientists that know that, because I do think the general impression is that the phase 3 studies are oftentimes set up more with the idea of marketing and indication than necessarily the science or the real utility for the patients that need it. And so there is that group that don't participate in phase 3 studies as much because of that feeling. So to the extent that the sponsors overcome that and make the people that are part of it really believe that it's more focused on the best biomarkers or where the patients are going to have the biggest impact, not necessarily the biggest market, that would help.
Let me just add sorry, Sharon. I think this is where post-marketing real-world data can really play a major role, especially if we can all look in a broader way at multiple and diverse data sets after launch. Because what we'd ultimately like to get to is if there's we can look at all these data sets and we can look at the phase 3 data and say, on average, if a patient is sitting in front of you, on average, the chances that you'll benefit, you'll probably have a 40% reduction in this, but you have a risk of having this bad side effect, it's 5%. But what we'd really like to get to is to go beyond that, right? That's the generalizable efficacy and safety. You want to be able to look at a person and say, that's what we saw overall, but in actually 30,000 people just like you, based on your baseline factors, your age, your gender, what other meds you take, et cetera, and also people who watch the same TV show, bought the same things on Amazon, et cetera. Okay, that's in the future. But anyway, 10 to 20, it depends on how well Rob does in his new job. But basically what we'd like to say is, 10 to 20,000 people like you, though, didn't have a 50% reduction in risk. They only had a 20% reduction in risk, but they also only had a 0.1% chance of having this really bad side effect. And I think that's really I think some of the value that we could see in predictive analytics in the future, using, again, the phase 3 data to some extent, but more importantly, as we're able to do more studies in large databases, more large pragmatic trials, and gather more observational data from a diverse variety of systems, we'll be able to do more of that in the future.
Thank you. My name is John Birch. I'm a member of the Mid-America Angel Investment Capital Network. I'm an observer and I'm here to learn. But I do have some questions. Registries were discussed a fair amount and are certainly getting a growing amount of attention. And I guess they fall in the real world category, generally speaking. But as a matter of fact, you may not be aware that I've seen some market forecasts that the market of registry software is growing from somewhere around $300 million a year now to over $2 billion within the next 10 years. Those are projections. I'm not sure it's really going to happen, but there's a huge amount of interest in registry software now that all this data is digital. So I guess my first question is about registries and the possible relationship between patient registries or research registries, so many different kinds, and random controlled trials. The Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative has done the study on, or has an ongoing study on registries. And one of the things I learned by looking over their records was about a trial done in Scandinavia called the TASTE trial. The T stands for tachycardia. I don't remember the rest, but it's a cardiology application, and they did a random controlled trial, but because they were able to use a good cardiology registry to begin with, the cost, instead of being the estimated $14 million to do the random controlled trial in a conventional way, was less than $500,000. That just speaks volumes to me. As some indication of the driving force that exists here. So it draws attention then to the two registries. What makes a good registry and a bad registry? What kind of registry can serve that sort of need, or what other needs might there be? So I just throw that out as a general question. I'd like to just throw a second question out because it's
just
related.
because we're short on time, and we have two other people. We're ending in 3 minutes, so maybe
the beauty of registries is that they are patient-centered, longitudinal patient-centered within at least some time period. How much additional value would that add to the real-world data out there if we could have registries that are genuinely longitudinal, lifelong?
Yeah. Just one word on the registry. So the CTSA and NCATS is funding right now a clinical trial on top of a congenital heart disease registry at Hopkins and Duke and our place at All Children's, which is exactly what you're trying to do. I mean, the process of identifying, meeting the eligibility criteria, the follow-up data, and the system to find the patients is already there. It's a relatively rare population. I think you're right. There's the possibility of putting clinical trials on top of registries that, may lead to a very efficient design and be closer to real world, although you'd have to look at the eligibility criteria, I think, to really make sure that you're meeting that real world criteria.
And patients want the data in a trial that's clinical put back into a registry so that it can be used again later if there needs to be either adverse event follow-up and other things, so that these can be very rich data sets.
And I would just, one word of caution, just because it's a registry doesn't necessarily make it patient-centered. And so I think we have to be cautious about that too.
One additional comment, particularly with some very high-cost gene therapies on the horizon that may be worth it if they do deliver a long-term cure or partial cure, it's going to be particularly important to use those to monitor the effectiveness of those new treatments over time. So critically important for those emerging areas as well.
Here.
Rory Collins, Oxford. I wanted to follow up on the points that Joan Wallstraker made and ask if she might like to expand on them. They're certainly points I agreed with, but the limitations of randomized controlled trials, I mean, at least as practiced in compliance with ICH GCP and regulatory pressures that people feel, were described in some detail. But no one described the limitations of observational studies. I mean, it may well be expedient, it may be seductive to use these big databases, but the evidence from the past is that they are often not reliable. That is, you can't rely on them to tell you what treatments do or don't do. And I just listened to this, and I worry that we're planning on a very large scale to repeat the errors of the past. HRT, for example, and coronary disease, vitamins and coronary disease and cancer. And so, I mean, I do think that before jumping into this, it is important to go back to the scientific principles of why we randomized in the first place, and perhaps think about whether the solution is not to use large observational studies, but actually to fix the randomized control process so that they do address the issues that are raised, particularly around generalizability. So I wonder whether Joanne might like to expand on the points I think she was talking about there.
Yeah, no, thank you for raising that. I absolutely agree with you. I think there's a place for observational data, which is non-randomized, but it's observational, what's happening in the real world with our products, with other treatments, et cetera. And it's still a very important place for randomization. And because I think we've all learned that you can't always be sure that you've controlled for all of the bias that you might see in just observing data. And that's why I said, maybe I wasn't clear enough, but I hope I was, that randomized pragmatic trials, randomized platform trials, I think have a very important role, and you can do them within the health system. And I think we are trying to do these more and more. We should be trying to do these more and more. And there's a very important role. But there is also a potential role for looking at observational data, particularly as we've been looking more and more at safety data, and actually proactively looking at safety data in observational databases, and also for looking at predictive modeling. So we can try to understand, as I said before, I won't repeat that example, but again, maximizing the benefit, minimizing the risk. And I think that's where they kind of fit hand in glove. And we should use all of the tools in our tool chest to really feed into a learning healthcare system. And I think, and not just stop either with either of those two tools. We should continue to do those. And even after we get the results of our large pragmatic trial, then follow up and see, did we change clinical practice? What else have we learned? Are we minimizing risk, maximizing benefit? Can we do better? Do an observational study, see how it's going, and get the data, and then see if we need to modify based on that. Thank you.
I think the theme of that question is one that's going to come up today and tomorrow. The evidence points to the fact that we're 1 minute past when the session is supposed to end, so we need to take an evidence-based break. We will resume at 11:30, but please join me in thanking all of the panelists for this discussion.